Welcome to Rad Tech Review. Let's get into kVp versus MA questions. The first set. What does kVp stand for? What does MA stand for? What does kVp control? What does MA control? Let's check the answers. What does kVp stand for? Kilovoltage peak. What does MA stand for? Milliamperage. What does kVp control? Energy and penetration. What does MA control? Quantity of electrons. Next set of questions. How does kVp affect contrast? How does kVp affect penetration? How does MA affect density? Does MA affect contrast? Let's check your answers. How does kVp affect contrast? Higher kVp equals lower contrast. How does kVp affect penetration? Higher kVp equals more penetration. How does MA affect density? It increases density. Does MA affect contrast? No. Next set of questions. What happens if kVp increases? What happens if MA increases? What controls beam quality? What controls beam quantity? Let's check your answers. What happens if kVp increases? Energy and penetration increase. What happens if MA increases? More X-rays are produced. What controls beam quality? kVp. What controls beam quantity? MA. Next set of questions. Which affects contrast the most? Which affects exposure directly? Which change photon energy? Which changes number of photons? Let's check your answers. Which affects contrast the most? The kVp. Which affects exposure directly? The MA. Which changes photon energy? The kVp. Which changes number of photons? The MA. Time for the speed round. kVp controls what? MA controls what? Which affects contrast? Which affects density? Which controls energy? Which controls quantity? And the answers are kVp controls energy and penetration. MA controls quantity. Which affects contrast? The kVp. Which affects the density? The MA. Which controls density? kVp. Which controls quantity? The MA. If you got all those, you're in a good spot. Replay this on your next drive. Repeat, replay, retain.